In this event, we'll be defining API first and reviewing what it enables. We'll also focus in on one API first company in particular to see what lessons they've learned creating an API first business from the ground up. But first, what exactly is API first and what does API first development entail? Well, an API first method is a lot like how it sounds. Instead of going straight to the code or designing the application and user interfaces, you first focus on establishing the connective tissue between services. API first development puts the creation of the API and its consumption model ahead of other focuses. API first is becoming a popular strategy for internal microservices and is also embraced by popular API as a product companies. To enact API first development, teams often utilize shared style guides, standard specifications, and relevant tooling to ensure consistency across an organization's tech stack. So building APIs early on within the design phase can bring a good amount of benefits to a business. For example, encouraging common interfaces makes your services inherently more reusable. Also, by putting focus on the consumption model ahead of other factors, you can significantly improve developer experience as it makes your applications easier to discover and build upon. This can greatly aid software development and benefit externalization efforts too, such as if a company decides to open up a microservice to select partners or to the wider public. Emphasis on a design-first approach also improves consistency from the onset as you're providing more guardrails for developers. API first provides more flexibility to add or remove features, and arguably it fits into the agile development principles pretty well. Of course, no approach comes without its caveats, and embracing an API first approach does have a few challenges. For one, it does require a significant culture change, and you really need buy-in from across an organization to make it worth your while. This might require some lead time to implement. Secondly, API first does require some abstract thinking and architectural planning, which is a step away from the code. You must consider how other engineers might want to access your resources. And this kind of thinking goes against the code first mentalities of just getting things done quickly. API first might also be a significant change to the usual development workflow, and you could be dealing with legacy technology that wasn't implemented in this style. And lastly, as we'll explore later on, it can be challenging to keep a lean API first approach and not be constantly over-developing to meet nuanced client demands. So these are just a handful of high-level considerations to think about when it comes to API first. These are kind of ideas we've covered on the blog in the past. And to dive deeper, we've brought in two experts with a lot of knowledge in this field. First up, we'll be featuring Joyce Linn, Head of Developer Relations at Postman. In her talk, Going API First, Joyce will introduce the key characteristics of API first companies. After that, Charlie Davies, CEO of TravelTime, will explore some lessons learned transitioning into an API first company. For those of you tuning in live, please write in your questions into the chat throughout the event, and we'll take them all in the Q&A after these two presentations. So there's my intro. Thanks so much for being with us, Joyce, and feel free to start whenever you're ready.
All right, let me share my screen. I'm really glad you had that intro, and I'm really glad that we won't have to argue too much this morning.
Yeah, I was worried about that. Yeah.
I was a little bit worried if I was going to be contradicting everything. And then when Charlie goes, poor Charlie is going to have to compare and contrast. Okay.
I'll do my best.
Okay, so my slide's good?
Looks great.
Okay. Thank you for that intro. My name is Joyce Linn. I'm the head of developer relations for Postman. Postman is an API platform used by 20 million people who work with APIs. And lots of people know Postman because they consume APIs. That's one API lifecycle there on the right. But a lot of teams are also familiar with producing APIs. And so API first is an approach for API producers. Specifically, it talks about defining and designing an API contract, and then using that contract to generate tests and documentation to then deploy, observe, and distribute your APIs. So in this session, we'll talk about a little bit deeper into what Bill already mentioned. What does API first mean? And then we'll look at what API first looks like in theory, and then compare it with what it looks like in practice in real organizations. And then I'll leave with a couple takeaways for you to consider on your API first journey. Let's start with a brief overview of API first. What does it even mean? Bill already gave us a great primer. So Postman has a state of the API survey that we just issued the results. It's fresh results, fresh off the presses. We asked 37,000 respondents, and there's an entire section on API first strategy. So we asked them, what does API first mean to you? And let's start at the bottom there. There's a lot of people that work with APIs that aren't really sure what API first means. The next most popular answer is defining business requirements before defining and designing APIs. And then moving up, developing APIs before developing dependent apps and integrations. And the most popular answer there is defining and designing APIs and schema, that's the key word there, and schema before beginning development. So to better understand API first, Bill mentioned this very briefly, let's talk about the opposite, API last. So this means building out all of your applications first before even thinking about your API. And then somebody comes up to you and says, hey, we didn't expect this, but imagine that. Consumers are asking for this other feature. No problem. We'll just update that API. We'll add a new endpoint, update the functionality, and you're all set. Oopsie, well, we totally didn't expect this, but it seems like consumers are really into mobile apps these days. Could you, okay, sure. We'll just add a new API. We need to build out an entirely separate API. We didn't anticipate mobile users, but that should do it. Okay, all set. Well, actually, a lot of our partners are asking for, should we maybe offer a partner API? So this is what it looks like if you're reacting with APIs after the functionality is already baked, after all that has already been released. And then, as Bill mentioned, you end up with a really disjointed developer experience, a little bit of a Frankenstein-esque approach to API development, and a lot of rework. And so you might be asking yourself, this sounds intellectually correct, but do teams actually work like this? Yes. So Etsy famously talked about their transition to API first. All of the code that was built for the website then had to be rebuilt in our API to be used by iOS and Android apps. This was back in the day when mobile was becoming a thing, and Etsy engineers did not anticipate mobile, so they didn't build their API to allow for other platforms. So Etsy painfully transitioned. And when you ask other API first leaders, what does API first mean to you? Somebody who identifies as being API first. It's actually that top category that is the most popular answer among API first leaders. So defining and designing APIs and schema-driven development is the most popular definition, especially among API first leaders. So what kind of schemas are they talking about? Again, our survey said we're actually looking at the blue lines, the aggregate blue lines, and the further left they go, the more market share they have. So the most popular schema is JSON schema for data formats, for validating payloads. But when you talk about API specifications, you're looking at OpenAPI v2, aka Swagger 2, and OpenAPI v3. So OpenAPI v2 still has the most market share, but it's declining. And OpenAPI v3 is has the highest growth rate, accounting for people transitioning from v2 to v3 as well as new users. So for teams that are using API specifications like OpenAPI, why are they doing this? And the general reasons are listed here, but one of the reasons is at the very, very bottom. 75% of people believe developers at API first companies are happier because it lets them do all this other stuff. So how does API first get all that? Can API first buy happiness? I think that's going to be my new blog title. So how does API first get you there? What does it look like in theory? So this is a bit chewy, we'll walk through it. So the first decision that you come to as an API producer is, do you develop the API first? If yes, check. Do you design the API first? Yes, check. Do you use a schema and do you use it to gain alignment among stakeholders? If you answered yes, then you are legitimately API first. I call it the flavor of schema driven. And the differentiator here is that you have an API contract. With an API contract, you have all the design benefits of API first. And then if you take it one step further and auto-generate mock servers, documentation, contract test code, all the other things that you can generate from an open API file or a Postman collection, then you're also reaping the development benefits of API first too. So the schema acts like an API contract, so then you can experience the design benefits. You have all the the contract, the agreed upon, the agreement between the producer and the potential consumers, and then you can use that for parallel development to decouple your teams. And then you can also use the API contract to reap the development benefits. And some of the common workflows that are in API first are proposing an API design. Did you even propose it to potential stakeholders? And collecting feedback so that you're able to future-proof and then gain consensus on not fully future-proof, but at least have a view of what's coming ahead, and then gain consensus on what the API will look like. And you're negotiating, and then once you have a contract, that agreement, it's a pact between the producer and the consumers. And now that you have a common agreement, you can use the API contract for parallel development between producers and consumers, between tester and dev, between builder and writer. And you're able to use that API contract to auto-generate all this other stuff. So one popular workflow among that is consumer-driven contract testing. Bill mentioned microservices, and how do you keep from releasing breaking changes to consumers is using that contract to build against, and then to ensure that the consumers understand what is going to be released. Okay, so yes, this is API first. At every decision point, at every, I don't know what shape this is, quadrant, at every decision point, we answered yes. But what happens when you answer no at any point along the way? Are you still API first? Can you still call yourself API first? So let's take a look at what it looks like in practice. So this is still the same decision tree. I just had to futz it around a bit just to fit more on the page. So same decision tree we just looked at. This is our happy path. We answered yes along the way. What happens when we answer no at any given point? The first one, do you develop the API first? If you answer no, definitively, your API last development, no two ways about it, okay? Your API last. However, there's a lot of people that are API last, a lot of teams that are API last that are still moving towards API first. And it's because they're backing into Open API or Postman collections in order to auto-generate a lot of that stuff. So you don't have any of the design benefits, but they're still trying to take advantage of some of the development benefits. Okay, the next decision is, do you design the API first? If you answer no, you're developing the API first, but you don't it's the opposite. You're not developing the API first, but you're designing it first. Okay, so if you do that, then you are called prototype first or code first. So again, you don't get the design benefits of API first, but you can still try to take advantage of some of the development benefits. And in the next decision, do you use an API schema to gain alignment among stakeholders? It's not enough to say, do you use an API schema? Because people backing into Open API will say, yes, I use a schema. So are you using it to gain alignment among stakeholders? If you answered no, you still have one more shot. Do you use any similar tool like a written document or anything like that to gain alignment among stakeholders? Are you circulating the ideas among stakeholders? If you still answer no, I can't help you there. You're not reaping the design benefits. However, you can call yourself design-driven, and I differentiate between design-driven and schema-driven because they're kind of similar, but the difference is that with design-driven, you're not getting the full design benefits, and because you're one step further away from the development benefits. So in the design-driven, you need to then create the Open API or Postman collection or whatever you're doing to auto-generate some of those elements, versus with schema-driven, your agreement is the thing that you're using to then generate those elements. So it's one more step, and so it's that teeny bit more effort. Actually, I don't want to call it teeny bit more effort, but it's more effort to keep everything in sync. All right. So what do we learn from all of this? These are takeaways that you might be thinking about in your own API first journey. We already talked about this very briefly earlier, but we talked about the design benefits and the development benefits. So the design benefits, I think primarily are a lot of them to be said, but earlier feedback, even the process of collecting that feedback and getting stakeholder buy-in allows you to more likely to future-proof your API. And you're also reducing development costs because you're building things that people actually want. You're validating that early from various stakeholders, and that's going to reduce a lot of rework. So you actually get faster development time in the longer overall development lifecycle. However, in the immediate future, you're going to be spending more time to actually hash out and have those discussions. The other type of benefits is the development benefits. So of course, if you have an API schema, once you have that, you can immediately generate. It's the difference between, minutes versus weeks in some cases. So you have a faster development time and faster growth because you're taking future functionality into account. That's what I mean by future proofing. You're never fully future proof, but you're taking into account different stakeholders that have more information than just your team. And so you're going to be building more resilient APIs. Okay, we also talked about common API workflows, collecting the feedback. That's a big deal. API contract is one of the biggest hallmarks of API first. And if you say your contract is a written document, if you say it's open API, if you say it's a Postman collection, whatever that is going to enable a lot of the design benefits as well as the development benefits. And the reason why is because in some cases you can automatically generate some stuff, but in a lot of cases you can enable parallel development because everyone is on the same page. And then we talked briefly about consumer-driven contract testing, which again is driven by the contract that both producers and consumers are looking at. And that gives them the confidence to not release breaking changes. Okay, we also learned that there's a bunch of different flavors of API first. So API first leaders typically say it's schema first, API contract all the way. However, there's a lot of teams that are slowly more and more starting to identify as API first. And even if they don't call themselves API first, some call themselves developer first, some call themselves, we do APIs, we make APIs. They don't want to label themselves API first, but they're moving towards API first by taking these steps. So there's a lot of different flavors of API first, and these are just 4 archetypes. I'm curious out there in the audience, which archetype your organization falls in, or if you're not even playing on the field yet. The last thing I want to mention is this is the chief evangelist at Postman, Ken Lane, also known as API evangelist. This is a tweet from him. I am moving forward under the assumption that very few people actually care about API specs. They only care about the outcomes they enable. And I think this is incredibly true. So no API architect, no API platform lead, no one wakes up and says, I want to do API first. Show me the schemas, we'll just roll it in our workflow immediately. It's actually hard from an organizational change perspective, and it's hard work. So why do people do this? If the person in the role doesn't feel the pain, doesn't have to do the rework, doesn't experience the Frankenstein developer experience, isn't impacted by breaking changes, if they don't feel the pain or they don't see the outcomes, I have better governance, I have better discoverability, I have faster development costs, all that other stuff, they're not going to do it, and it's going to be a long slog ahead. So a lot of lessons learned. Everyone's journey to API first, it's never smooth, and it's always a continuous and iterative process. Nobody sits at the top of the hill saying, I'm API first, done with that. And it requires buy-in from all directions. It's usually an initiative and an organization led from the top by a governance team or some sort of manager that wants to enable some of these benefits, but it requires support from the bottoms up from the engineers that are going to be practicing this. Organizational culture hugely shapes every journey. I've seen virtually identical companies in terms of what they offer to developers come at API first completely differently due to their organizational culture, and only outcomes matter. So if you're interested in some of this, there's some additional resources. Postman actually has our very own graphic novel dedicated to API first. Ken Lane has a podcast called Breaking Changes, specifically interviewing organizational leaders about API first. So a lot of resources there. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Joyce. I might add, I'm an avid listener of Breaking Changes, and I love all the content that Postman puts out, especially the State of the API report. Super helpful. And I'm glad you brought in some of those stats into the presentation. A lot of helpful distinctions because there's so many nuances here. And like you said, everyone has a slightly different flavor with their approach. So I'm excited to dig in a little bit deeper into some of those areas. And I want to remind everyone who's tuning in live, feel free to, put some questions in the Q&A, and we'll take that after the next session. We're just going to move on right now to Charlie to talk about some of the other repercussions of API first in practice. So yeah, whenever you're ready, Charlie.
Hello, how are we doing? Yeah, let me just flip this over. So yeah, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to do a slightly different approach on API first, more of the commercial product side, not the development side, and a bit of our story about doing that. So yeah, Bill, thank you so much for having me, and Joyce, thanks so much for your presentation just before. So yeah, hello everyone. My name is Charlie Davies. I'm the CEO and co-founder of TravelTime. We're HQ'd out of London, UK, but we've got development offices throughout Europe. And primarily, we are focused as an API first company, creating high performance and scalable mobility APIs. Now, that's a lot of words, and it might not mean too much off the bat, but the best way for me to describe the reason why we started developing TravelTime and the problems we were trying to solve is based solely in location search and the matching of location data. And it started off with this idea that what if we could search using the real physical world inside of search? So what I mean by that is that when we're doing searching majoritively on locations today, we're limited by 3 different modes. And that is usually what can I do within 1 mile, 5 miles, or 10 miles, that lovely distance radial. What can I do inside of that bounding box? Usually, search here in the current view that you've got, or inside of a polygon, which might be a city or an area such as Soho in London, a municipality. And the reason why these are used as database methods and ways to call back locations into existing applications is that they're very, very fast. They're very, very fast. You can perform those searches on millions of points of data in sub-millisecond response times. And performance when it comes to search, especially when buying is involved, the decision to go from a user to a consumer, is that online, conversions are king. The ability for us to move a user into an application and get them out the other end by actually becoming commercially valuable, whether that's booking a hotel, a restaurant, a job, a property, whatever it may be, when location is part of that buying process, performance is directly linked to those conversions. And these sites live and die by that conversion rate. And performance really, really, really does affect it. There are tons and tons of studies on this, but performance is something that I religiously and relentlessly focus on as our products at TravelTime. And the reason for that is that 100 milliseconds degradation can lead to a 1% fall in sales. Now, this came out of a study from Amazon, and that was essentially looking at how does latency affect their sales. Now, there's, as I said, tons on this, but if we were to have a search that was actually able to take into account what we can do in the physical world and how we're going to search the physical world around us to make sure that's matched in those applications to how you and I use the world around us, what we couldn't have is an API that was slow, because any value that it gave would be removed by the performance degradation inside of that application. So there was a really strong reason that we found why people weren't searching the world in the way we use the world, and that was primarily linked to performance. And just to finish on this section on the value add of what we do. So right now, if you're searching any location driven application where location is part of that buying process, so recruitment, property, holidays, tourism, whatever it may be, you're probably doing a default of what you can do within 5 miles, and that's 5 miles from central London. But if I actually wanted to do that by car, what can I do in 45 minutes by driving? Then this would be the area that you should actually be searching by. Or it could be 45 minutes by underground in the metro service in London. And you can see here that the area that you're actually getting to along these train lines is very different. And when you add in mainline services to that as well, the area you can get to is much smaller in the middle, but growing outside because it's on a fast train line. And what we found is that when we added all of these together, we actually, any sort of existing location-based search, half of them are irrelevant. 50% of all the results that are being optimized by distance are completely irrelevant to the searcher. And when we talk about relevancy, if we had another point in the application where we knew half of the results were just wrong, we would work really hard to fix that. But until TravelTime came along, there really wasn't an option for developers to actually perform very relevant or hyper relevant, location searches inside of the database. And even more importantly, that there could be, tons of missed opportunities as well. So, what is outside of that search that I could actually get to within 45 minutes because it's on a fast train line. So we can almost double the relevancy of any location-based search. And when we first released this, we were thrilled. We were very, very excited that we got it to work just in the UK at a performance that was great enough for us to actually launch this with our first customers. And finding our first customers wasn't really driven with API first, because what we were doing when we began was trying to solve a specific problem. And that problem was, how do we make location search globally more relevant? How do we solve the problem that I was just going through? But to do that, we didn't have any customers that we could test an API on. And we certainly weren't going to try and launch a company that was talking to consumers while we were trying to develop this technology at the same time. Our ambitions essentially didn't match our bank account at that point. So we had to go and find our first customers and work incredibly closely with them. So at this point, we were more solution driven in the fact that we can solve this specific problem for you. And our first customers in the property and then recruitment market throughout the UK and Europe were incredibly helpful for us to actually find out what our APIs should actually end up doing. And we had to work really, really closely with their development team, sometimes launching custom environments, sometimes changing API specifications. So we were going backwards and forwards with them, and we had to, right? Because if we didn't do that, then, well, we wouldn't have been able to raise our first invoices as a company and prove that there was value in what we were doing. And we still work very closely with lots of those customers, but we realized very quickly that there were some decisions that we needed to make. And we were sort of going round in circles, so to speak, and a lovely image of a roundabout to show that off. But we sort of had this problem of scale. And the problem of scale was, we know that there are tons and tons of applications out there that could make use of what we have. And what we're doing right now is selling a benefit. We're going out to customers and telling them that they should be doing something different and leading with that. And we obviously had to focus on the API. The API was still our product, but we weren't necessarily an API first company. We were more a search first company, or a location first, a search first company. And we went around the houses a little bit, and we started building, the option of, do we do self-serve or end-to-end? And what we ended up doing was actually building those full solutions. So, specifically for customers, here's an endpoint that is for you. It is an API, but it's an API first for you only. Or we actually started to dabble in, taking the value of our own API and trying to build a business on top of that. So having self-serve tools that were interacting with our API. One of them was able to, produce zip codes or postcodes or areas that someone could download inside of their application. But what this did is really muddied the waters in between what we were doing as a development team. Were we developing APIs that we were trying to then get other developers to use and monetize that traffic? Or were we building our own APIs to then exploit applications that we could build on top of that? Now, it's super important that that we grew our company organically to profitability before we actually raised any institutional funding. So it was always really crucial for us to actually make sure we were focusing on getting revenue first. And this is why we had to focus so heavily on those end-to-end solutions, as well as with our existing customers and growing them on a very sort of one-to-one basis. But we found, pretty quickly it didn't scale. We're a small team, we're a team of 45, and trying to do all these things simultaneously and have different infrastructure, different environments to maintain, different applications, while trying to do something that's actually pretty hard to do, which is searching the world in the way that we use the world around us. It was tough, and we certainly weren't scaling as much as we would like. And when we looked back on ourselves, as we do regularly, we found that actually to focus on the solution was the wrong thing, and to focus on the API, to become an API first company where we were just talking about APIs, was a way that we could reach far more people than just talking about one of the benefits of our API. we had focused far too much on those one-to-one customers or custom solutions. And when I say too much, I don't mean that it was a mistake. It just means that at the point that we were scaling the company, it was needed, warranted, perfect way to do it. But we needed to focus more on the building block, not just that end-to-end solution. And that building block is, I wrote it in the blog that we did for Nordic APIs, and it's really that we're not selling the building. We were selling the building, not the bricks. You know, we were coming to people and saying, here's a solution that can solve a specific problem for you. We weren't saying, hey, here's an API. Why don't you see what you can do with it inside of your existing application with your development team? So we really had to refocus and really hone in on what we were seeing already, and that was the success of our API being used in lots and lots of different ways, and actually more so outside of that existing reason we started TravelTime and started developing the API in the first place. We really needed to focus down onto what was really working. And that meant to have one API with no custom environments that had many, many use cases on top of it. And by many use cases, I mean that through one API, one stack, one set of documentation. We still do have a couple of old custom environments, but we've done very well to remove the majority of them. It's just one API that we maintain, and customers interact with just that API, and everyone gets the same thing. But to release those building blocks out there, you cannot lead with what the benefits of those blocks are. You have to be more trustworthy in the people that are getting those bricks and seeing what they're building. But there are many, many hurdles that you need to get over in order to really sell as API first. I think I've been over the existing one of not focusing on what the API solves, but more of what the API technically does. You can obviously talk in some of your marketing pieces around how the API is being used and sort of inspire other people, but you're not leading with that solution. Now, when it comes to APIs, there's going to be tons of hurdles, but the first and last and biggest hurdle is going to be developers. And for developers, documentation, the docs are the product. They are probably the first thing they see. And we have invested a lot of time and a lot of money into making sure that our docs are the best they possibly can be. Now, we were out in the market of APIs, and we thought that Stripe had brilliant API documentation. So you might see some flattery of imitation through how we've designed our documentation. But feel free to go to docs.traveltime.com, give us your feedback on what you think the API is like. There's a feedback form actually right on the documentation itself. And that's one thing that we're continuously doing, is making sure that our docs are aligned with what the API does and what developers want from that API through the applications that they're building. And you can see here that we've got the Postman collections, we've got our SDKs, we've got our plugins into databases like Elastic and Solar, and a relentless focus on SDKs to make sure that when developers come along, that they are able to access and use our API really easily, without much thought. We're not trying to be too clever. We're just giving them what they want. Now, one of the metrics we use to get on this is activation time. Now, we're tracking activation time for every key that comes in, whether someone has activated, and our goal is that someone can go from seeing our documentation, getting a key, and getting a request in less than 5 minutes. Now, they can actually do it in less than 5 minutes. It's almost around sort of 1 or 2 minutes around using specific parts of the API. And one thing we did recently around this to actually improve activation time was to replicate our API as a GET request as well as a POST request. Now, for those of you not familiar with what the differences are on those, a GET request essentially is just a long string of a URL. A POST request means that you have to have a body of JSON that's coming along with that URL to the endpoint. Now, ultimately, they do the same thing, but a GET request is much easier to construct in code. It's much easier to test. And we've seen that multiple times where someone might start with a GET request, say, hey, this does what I need it to do, then move to a POST request, having that over JSON. And then when they want to move to performance side, using something like protocol buffers to make sure that they have got the best performance coming out. And that might be through one of our applications or one of our SDKs, but we're able to take them very much from that first experience, what is this API? How do I get onto it? and then lead them all the way through production of their application using our API in the most performant way. If you try and start the other way, you're explaining too much and you lose people, because what you're saying is that we're really fast, we're really performant. If you just want to do protocol buffers, and if you go work protocol buffers, they're not the best way to sort of understand what an API does. In fact, they can be quite confusing at times. Now, of the many hurdles, documentations, but also developers. Now, when you're selling an API, you've got to talk to multiple different stakeholders. You have product managers, commercial, understanding impact and security of the API that's being used in live environments with sensitive customer data. But one thing that we have found, which was kind of obvious, but I guess at the same time surprising, is that in our development team, we have to have a high level of technical excellence for the products that we're building. But that doesn't have to be replicated in every other development team. And in other development teams, when they get onto APIs for the first time, it might be that they found it, it might be that the product managers, found it. Maybe it's come through an outbound sales approach from us, and they're wanting to qualify that API. What we tend to find is that those tasks are given to junior members of the team. So developers that might be in their first job or early stage of their career. And you need to make sure that the documentation is as easy to understand for a very junior developer, but it's also got enough detail and experience for a senior developer as well. So it's one set of documentation that multiple people can read. And that was actually a harder thing for us to do, because we were very used to talking about our APIs specifically to the customers when we had them in the room and we knew what their application stack was, and we could almost sometimes give them a unique version of the docs for them. So we knew that when they were reading it, it was perfect for them. But to transition that back, to abstract ourselves back another layer and say, how do we make sure that anyone of any developer experience, and actually using multiple different languages and multiple different databases, can experience our documentation for the first time? And that was a really, our documentation is never going to be finished. We'll continuously try and make it better. And when we put that effort and that focus in, our activation percentage went up, our activation time went down, and we've actually seen our API to be the busiest that it ever has been. Pricing is another conversation that we're almost eternally having at TravelTime. And those conversations happen by us releasing pricing, onboarding customers with pricing, seeing how that pricing relates to our costs, seeing how easy it is to understand, and making sure, one, that we're able to drive and build a business from our API, that it's not just a lost leader, but it actually has the mechanics to scale and build a great business around that API. But pricing needs to be simple. And I speak from experience on this. I've got it way more wrong than I've ever got it right. And you really are what you listen to in terms of pricing. And I think the more that you get inside your own head and try and think that you've sort of built a great model, when you actually give it to customers who have the attention span of about 20 or 30 seconds, maybe even less than that, they have not got time for you to explain how great you think your pricing model is. And I say that with a wry smile, because I know that potentially some of my team are on this and we're experiencing this almost on a day-to-day basis. And I think, the conversation of pricing is just an eternal conversation at TravelTime to make sure that we're doing the best that we possibly can. And that involves, releasing pay-as-you-go models to drive that early acquisition and then scaling them all the way up to tiers. And we had to do this a lot through experimentation. We had to release it. We had to get people onto it and see how their pricing was working and how it was scaling. And essentially, with pricing, it has to be able to be understood very, very quickly by one person just in their head when they're on that pricing page right there. We actually see so much engagement from our homepage to our pricing page and beyond, and it's becoming more and more the first thing that people immediately go to. API, great, got it, okay, pricing, bang, what's that? I need to understand it. And they're looking left and right in the market to out to your competition, and you need to make it, as simple as possible. And I could share with you Excels that we've built that were super clever. It adjusted perfectly to our costs. We could scale, we could, put one number in here, it would tell us how much resource we would need, etc., etc. And they don't care. They just want a simple price that is explainable, that is comparable, that they're able to figure out very quickly. So it really doesn't matter how clever you think your pricing model is, the market and the customers will direct you in another way. And if you're not listening to that feedback, however humble pie it may be, you really need to. And this sort of leads us to how we think about developers at TravelTime today. I remember some of the early sales conversations that I was having. At that time, I was doing all the sales as well as leading all of the development. Was we were going in to almost tell people, hey, you're doing this wrong, we can make it better. And actually what we found is that doesn't always work so well for probably lots of obvious reasons, but we're actually there to inspire. We're there as that building block to inspire what developers can do. We're not there to dictate how exactly our API should be used, what applications it should be used in, and leading with all the benefits of how this API could work in different applications. It's actually there to solve the problem of the task that the developer has been given. And when we did this, we actually saw some immediate benefits. A 93% uplift to the product pages when our homepage focused on API first, and not the benefit of search. So actually we moved away from talking first about why we started, what search is and why our API works really well on that. It's definitely a use case we talk about elsewhere, but we don't lead with it. We lead with the fact that we're an API first company. And yeah, the uplift that we saw there was significant and growing, and we're just relentlessly honing in on all of that. And if we were to do this webinar again in 6 months, I'd have even more learnings, I hope, about how we got better and better and better at doing that. And to get better and better about, you have to be really humble about your metrics and your direction. The reason we started TravelTime around search led into then developing the API, talking to customers, and sometimes not focusing on the right metrics. We actually recently found that focusing more on one of our endpoints as a company would be much more better for us, much more focused. But it actually moves away from some of the first things that we did. So having that sort of humbleness around the metrics that you're doing, and also the direction that you're taking it in. Ultimately, it's the same product. It does the same thing. It's just the positioning in the market and how we're communicating that with people. If someone's looking for like a similar distance matrix API, and all we're talking about is how we make search more relevant and increase conversions, they're going to disappear, because that's talking about a solution. It's not talking about a building block. And a relentless focus on performance, always. I think if performance is not there, then people just move on very, very quickly. So we had to learn to stop, basically. We had to learn to stop just talking about the benefit of why we built it and actually think about the scale of what the API could do. And we had to start saying, no, we can't develop that thing for you. No, we can't do that. And when you've gone from having 0 revenue to growing it, it's really hard to get to that stage where you're actually telling customers to go away. It's hard work, but you have to do that to focus out on the scale. And developers will surprise you time and time and time and time again. Developers and coding, it is a creative thing. It can look very beautiful, both in its design and in its outcomes. But if you trust developers and give them a great API, great documentation, pricing they can understand, they will take it and build things that you could never have thought about. So even if you had the best homepage for every single solution that you could possibly imagine, developers will come up and the product teams around them will come up with better solutions you could have ever come up with. And I am seeing those on a daily basis at the moment. So the focus on customers early on is R&D. You're still figuring out what that API can do. But then you need to scale and focus as a one-to-many API first. And by that, I mean it's one API, it's one documentation. People can build lots of different types of applications on top of it. And that's how we've scaled TravelTime to now be processing over 10 billion locations per month. Quite eye-watering number. I remember when we first launched, you could actually see the requests sort of come in 1 an hour. We're now doing a ton more than that. But it's with myself, and I get the privilege of speaking about this today, but really it's the really hard work of the team at TravelTime, relentlessly focusing, going back over what we're doing to making sure that we're providing the best API experience to developers, so they can onboard, look at the docs themselves, and start building great applications. I'm going to stop there. I hope the timing was okay. I just want to say thank you so much for listening to me today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Charlie. Yeah,
No
great
problem.
presentation. I love the order of events here, because we saw what it means to develop API first, and then we tacked on what it means to actually market yourself as an API first company.
Yeah.
Because this is a trend we're seeing in the market. You know, this API first thing is really evolving. Actually, just got a PR today from a venture capital firm tracking API first companies that have raised 50 million or more, and
Yeah.
they were saying that there's 60 of them now meeting that threshold, and they raised 350 million across 8 rounds and 14 billion in total funding, and that's of Q3 this year. So it's a real movement, and we're seeing more and more businesses actually adopt this, not only in their marketing, but like what Joyce was saying, like in their development as well.
And it's really on the, I guess with the VCs tracking it, when we're speaking to investors and things, we're regularly getting compared to sort of SaaS metrics, because in a way we have a SaaS model in the fact of, it's a subscription service as opposed to, it's a similar basis, but actually beyond, so below that, the mechanics of the business is very, very different to what another SaaS model would be. So yeah, there's definitely some more education out there when talking to other people about what API first is, not just from a development sense, like an internal development sense, but just having that as a product. And yeah, it's fun. It's fun to work on.
I love how you talk about the R&D required to understand your core business. And I think they say that the things you do as a startup to get your first 1,000 customers like isn't scalable at all. Right?
No.
Then you realize that, and then you know how to scale some things after that.
And
this is a perfect model of that, I thought.
And I don't think it should be, right? I think the very first version of what we built, I had a hand in helping develop it, and it's never been touched again because it proved the point, but it wasn't scalable. And the pricing model wasn't, the business model wasn't, but we were just proving that we could actually get to the next stage. And then at some point you have to sort of, bite the bullet and go back and redo lots of things. But you have to do that in order to actually scale the business and the tech.
Absolutely.
I just tweeted.
To bring Joyce into this conversation. Yeah,
I just tweeted about that 93% lift. That's the 93% lift when your homepage focuses on the API instead of just the benefits. That's completely the opposite of what they teach you in marketing school. They say always don't talk about the features, talk about the benefits. It really speaks to your audience and what people are looking for. They're scanning. Yeah,
100%. I mean, when there's some of them behind me, but the books you read, you sort of focus on what the benefits are, not what the that comes later. Right. But in this sense, it's complete opposite way around, because you're actually speaking to a very, very creative audience, and it's unlikely they're just going to arrive. They're probably there with some intent. We have our outbound is different to our inbound in that sense, in the fact that we're educating out here, but we're sort of engaging and interrupting over here. So it's completely the other way around. And it's not without that sort of relentless going back and checking, we wouldn't have sort of got to that point.
Awesome. So Joyce, you presented a great continuum. Do you think you might add, are you selling yourself as an API first company to the very end of that, to be considered API first?
I feel like I heard API as a product a few times today, and I think that more and more API, you might lead with API, you might tack on an API as an offering, but I'm not sure. Like I did a really back of the envelope research study where I just looked at the top cloud API cloud companies, and it was like 99 of 100 had an API. Right. So like it's pretty savvy that you're leading with an API.
Yeah, they really tend to be not an afterthought, but like, oh, do you have an API? Like it's sort of the question at the end. It's not the thing you talk about. And when it comes to when you're actually trying to then sell into bigger organizations, you sort of got to be ready to present what you do differently. I mean, almost some ways, sort of to the technical audience, you're just presenting the API. To the other audience, you're presenting the actual solution that's going to benefit them. And certainly what we were doing too much before was trying to do too much of that at the same time. And you can't do that as a team. It's hard to have that, almost double speak at the same time of where you're going with it.
And Charlie,
sorry, Joyce.
Or I'm just curious, Charlie, your team did feel the pain though. You were building out custom solutions for every partner.
Not everyone, but some.
Yeah. Yeah, so until you feel that pain, you're not going to necessarily prioritize the composable elements.
Exactly. And I think all these are pain through hindsight, but they needed to happen. And I think, there's always that, I guess, being humble and saying it got us to this point. And my job on a day-to-day basis is to work on the problems that are immediately in front of us at TravelTime. Is not always to then look back and go, hey, we've achieved all this great stuff. And we wouldn't have achieved that without going through all of those pain points where, we're launching out, different different infrastructure to host what we do, and then having to sort of migrate these custom environments because there's contracts available to them. It's not perfect. You wouldn't want to necessarily blog about it or lead with it, but and it was a pain for the dev team, but it got us to where we are. So it was necessary to learn for sure.
Gotcha. All right, some questions are coming in here. Mira Balani is asking, we are embarking on the journey of convincing developers to go API first. We are currently generating the OAS from code, but we are already design first. It would be nice to have pointers here on going schema first and the advantages of that to help me get their buy-in. So maybe I'll put this one to Joyce. They're kind of at one part of the spectrum. So how do we kind of shift left to become more schema driven here?
I can tell you I can reiterate what the benefits are of being schema driven versus design driven. But I think what's important, what's going to be more effective for Mira is that understanding what are you hoping to get by being schema first, because both of you guys touched on it, but a lot of it's organizational culture. What are your existing workflows? And is it more trouble? Is it more work with less payoff to move to shift left, right? We know that shifting left is, has benefit, but how much benefit? Right. And so for like the difference between schema, I called it like an open API file, right? And then design could be a Word document. Postman collection falls somewhere in between, where some people use it like a Word document, some people use it like a schema. And somebody else had a question like, well, what's a contract? A contract versus the agreement is that it's enforceable, right? Mm-hmm. It has some built-in hooks to make it like validation. If you have to follow it, otherwise something doesn't release.
Right. Charlie, anything to add there?
No, I think it's when we talk about API first, we talk about that as a commercial thing, the placement of the products. Right. Internally, we're not there yet on being an API first in development either. So it's kind of.
I was going to ask you where in the continuum you guys are sitting, since Joyce was posing that question to everyone.
Yeah, it's we're getting better at it, but definitely there is still sort of legacy code in what we have that is holding together the product. The outcome of that is the same. It works at very high performance, and it's out there in now 85 countries that we're now live in. But yeah, we're not fully at the stage of being API first driven in all of our development practices either. So yeah, there's a balance there for us as well.
Yeah, an ongoing move. But it's great to know what it's like in practice, as Joyce, 100%. Said in her slideshow. There's a variance of this in real world settings. And at the end of the day, we're creating building blocks for other developers to use. Charlie, I really like how you say, let them be creative and innovative with whatever you're doing. Don't dictate too much.
Yeah.
And Sudhir Gupta is kind of talking about that idea. He's saying APIs are bundled to create API products that provide capabilities, and that becomes the building block. In that case, do you still think we should speak about APIs and not the problem they solve? We're already kind of talking about this, APIs, just mentioning it on the homepage, it has a little buzz to it. So
I think for us, and again, I hold the right to change this answer in 6 months' time. But right now, what we have found is that from an inbound point of view, so customers that are finding our documentation or our site through however they would get there, is that at that point, a developer is actually, they've got an intent. They know that they need to do something, and they have found your API as a result. And at that point, they just want to know what the API is. They want to know what the API is, what the documentation are, and what the pricing is. And that's it, really. However, from an outbound point of view, when we're out there talking, a bit like I am today or elsewhere, we're going to lead with what we think is the most interesting thing that our API does as a sort of inspirational thing to then get other people to think about how they could use our API in their application. So I think it's doing both, but doing them through different channels. Certainly, if someone arrives on our, and we've seen this, right, that 93% uplift, if someone arrives on our site and they have been looking for an API that does something similar to us, and we're just talking about a specific benefit in a specific vertical, they're going to disappear. Even if you abstract that vertical out, they're still going to disappear. So I think you can sort of do both, but certainly if you've got those inbound coming in, then 100% it's just about giving them what they're already looking for.
And I think the reason why it's so compelling to talk about an API on the homepage is because a lot of shoppers are just saying, check, they have an API. They haven't even started looking yet. Developers will then click through and look at the docs and say, oh, you only have one endpoint and it only allows me to get information. I can't actually do much with it. And so I think by then you've preserved part of your acquisition funnel. So really talking about where it is, like at it, it's all about your personal shoppers.
Yeah, you see that time and time again where someone has a product, maybe it's a SaaS product, and then it's developed. There'll be a developer tab at the top of the menu, like developers click here, and then there's an API and it talks about integrations that they have elsewhere to make things easier to use that. So sometimes, like a SaaS product, I know I'm going to Salesforce as an example, like Salesforce does something, but it's got its APIs that then help you use it more. It's a very different way of actually, you're driving usage into Salesforce. We're just trying to drive usage into the API, and it's different. And like I said, if developers are looking for us, they've already got that intent. So it's about giving them what they want immediately, as quickly as possible. Because we've all got the time. The attentions span is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And if you try and be too clever around pricing, around positioning, around talking about the best benefit, you're going to lose that attention and they'll just disappear somewhere else.
Charlie, you also mentioned that you have to cater to multiple audiences within the documentation, which rightfully call the product, I believe. And you also mentioned that you've been continually iterating that process. So I'm curious, like, if you could provide any specifics here, like, have you just been editing the layout, the organization of the documentation, or collecting feedback organically? Like, what has kind of fueled the creation of that product to serve multiple clients simultaneously?
So as the lead at TravelTime, I get to stand on the shoulder of the giants of our team, and it might be better that maybe we look to write a blog post around exactly what that process was. And I think some of them are even on the call right now. But I think that the sort of that time to understanding what the API can do really quickly is super, super important. We talk a lot about performance of our API. Now, to achieve the best performance, you've actually got to go pretty technical in terms of how the API works, understanding where it is. Someone isn't going to do that in the first call. They just want to know, does it work? Like, okay, does it make sense? Yeah. And that's why we released the get endpoint as well as the post. And when we spoke to our development team about this, they were like, it does the same thing. You're getting the same thing. The results coming back are exactly the same. And it was just a thing about, well, not every developer is as good as you, and we're very lucky to have such a strong team. So you need to almost ask them to think less about how they interpret documentation and more about how someone that might have just completed their first coding class or school or whatever may be, and to have that adjustment around in the back end, having very, very high performance, code and infrastructure, but at the front end, almost having a very, very dummy way of understanding what you're doing. And to have, as an API first, you have to be technically strong, right? Because your API is being integrated into other products. It has to have the buy-in of those guys from a CTO level right down to the developer level, that they're going to be happy to trust you of that API being in a live environment. But at the same time, the first person that sees your documentation isn't going to be the CTO or the head of software development. It's probably going to be that junior dev. And you've got to cater for all of them simultaneously. And it's probably, there's enough content there to maybe do several more webinars on it. And I know the big bits that we've been working on, but the real detail has come from the team.
Joyce, I'm curious to get your opinion. The creation of the contract and the maintenance of that, how does that affect, how the API is consumed? And does that increase developer experience and make it so that more types of developers are more comfortable with the service. Would you say that's a benefit of schema first?
Yeah, I was just creeping on TravelTime's docs too.
Oh, yeah.
I'll provide some feedback. But so, for example, if people are using Open API, one of the big reasons is for developer experience. They want to generate documentation, they want to generate API reference, they want to generate SDKs, code samples, like all of that kind of stuff. And if they have that and it's rich and informed, then it can pretty much automatically then update the properties that it lives on.
That's cool. Yeah.
And then your single source of truth becomes a lot easier instead of having like one single source of truth that informs a second single source of truth, and then it's like cascading.
Yeah.
Do you think the tooling is mature enough for that single source of truth to auto-generate SDKs, for example? I know this has kind of been a constant like back and forth thing in the API space. Either
Charlie, you open your mouth.
Yeah. Sorry, I just, because we did that, right? I think it was Swagger and then into the Open API. And then it was like, hey, we have just released an SDK for everything.
Right.
It's like, this is amazing. We've just gone from 0 SDKs to 100 SDKs or something. And and it does definitely 100% have some value. I think more so internally. If you're doing those internally and then you've got other applications interacting with it, it works really well because you've got an understanding of what the API does already, and there's going to be shortcuts to the code that you can write to actually have your own SDK for other teams. From a first view, those SDKs take a bit more time to curate specifically for that developer and that application in that language. And then it's not just the SDK, it's the documentation and the walkthroughs around that as well. And it's been a while since we looked at auto generation. We actually develop a lot of those SDKs internally. And actually developing the SDKs internally is a wonderful way to quote unquote eat your own dog food. And by that, you're actually then experiencing the API and you're going, why did we design it like that? And you're like, I don't know. and then you sort of go back and then go, well, actually that could be quite confusing for another developer. So it's really helpful. And I think for us, being that API first, we are an API product, we have to do it ourselves, but the auto generation definitely does have rich applications elsewhere.
Yeah, I think in the example about like generating 100 SDKs, like almost no one needs that. But if you have like 3 to 5, that's still a big deal for like maybe one junior dev to be working on. So it gets you like almost all the way there, but almost everything because of your own custom process or how you guys handle these properties or something does need some massaging.
Yeah.
Gotcha. We talked a lot about developer experience and the end business product and the benefits therein with API first. I'm curious to get your opinion on like if there are any benefits to security from taking an API first approach. Like from my point of view, it seems like APIs are more discoverable if you're going with this like schema driven process, and so auditing is improved and you can identify weak points. From your guys' perspective, what are the security benefits of this? Joyce, you want to kick this off?
Yeah, one of the Postman State of the API results benefits was eliminating security risks earlier in the process. And I think it just has to do with what visibility is of your API design early in the process to different stakeholders. So if you're lucky enough to have somebody who's security minded or a security engineer, they're able to weigh in on things. And there is the ability for like Open API, for example, to have automatic security checks or rule sets in place.
Yeah.
I think, one of the hurdles we've seen around that is maybe not so much in the API itself, but more of how the API is interpreted by other teams. So I said earlier on that we get classified in that SaaS model quite a bit, and then when we are speaking to larger companies that they need to go through security due diligence themselves, they look at us through the prism of a SaaS software that's going to embed lots of their data inside of it before it becomes useful. Whereas our APIs, we actually don't record any of our customer data at all. We don't record any of the locations coming in. We don't record what they're doing, purely because from a privacy point of view, we want to protect the data that our customers are sending us and not get into that data storage side. So there's that overhead of understanding what security for an API means for the data that they're transacting and sending to us. We actually powered the COVID testing for the UK. So every time someone was looking for a test, they would actually be using our API in the background. And obviously there's some sensitive information coming in through there. But because we're not recording any of it, it was much easier for us to get through those security due diligence side. Even though if you were to look at the sort of live map when those locations are coming in, we could actually see some of the areas where COVID hotspots were coming up before they were being reported, because we were so embedded in that application as well. So yeah, security for us, I mean, I know Joyce and I have talked about this Joyce from more of a technical sense, more from more of a commercial point of view. And I guess that's because where my technical background, but commercial sort of focus on my day to day is, yeah, just how other people interpret the security of those APIs. And yeah, when you speak to those, you get this, oh, great, deals going through, fantastic, contracting stage, and then you get a 100-page PDF to talk about your SaaS product, and you're like, it's not a SaaS product. And they're like, we don't care. You've got to fill this. Yeah. So that's another interesting hurdle to get over. I should have included that as another hurdle to get over. There's tons of them. They keep tripping us up.
Good on the ground knowledge right here. I like it. I love how both of you have interpreted API first in different contexts, because there's obviously the technical foundation, and then it's like what it means in the commercial field. So really happy to have both of you weigh in on this. I think this has been a really great, helpful event. I'd just like to open the floor for any last thoughts you might like to share with listeners on what API first means, and any lasting impressions on how to get there. Joyce, do you want to share anything before we kick this one off?
I will say, anybody who feels comfortable revealing what flavor of API first they are, please do, because I am very, very curious about what everyone is at. And Charlie, thank you for being so honest about like rating yourselves on where you are. I think API first can be super intimidating, but everyone interprets it differently. And so long as you're looking at it and thinking about it and like starting to make moves, like you'll get there one day. And nobody is ever there and done. It's just really a journey. Like the docs, it's a journey. It's a continuous evolution.
Yeah.
And like the space shouldn't be imparting any judgment on companies, no matter where they're at. Because it seems like at the end of the day, API first can buy happiness. So we should strive for that. And I want to see that blog post, Joyce.
Yeah.
Awesome. Charlie, any lasting impressions here?
No, it's just really great to be involved. I think it's been very nice and really rewarding for us as a team, as a company, to sort of focus more on the API. We were doing that, but maybe not doing it first. And it's just been a very cathartic thing for us to do, to focus on what we really need to do to scale things out. And yeah, just Bill, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today. And Joyce, it's been wonderful to meet you. I hope this isn't the last time, and it's been great to witness a sunrise in San Francisco across the medium of Zoom.
Yeah.
Yeah, really. The light is out. Okay, thank you so much. I'm just gonna end here with some wrap-up slides about updates from the world of Nordic APIs. Thank you so much to Charlie Davies and Joyce Linn for joining us today. We do have a newer ebook which kind of touches on some of these topics, called Developer Experience: Top Strategies to Improve the Developer Experience of your API. Organizing a lot of insights from the blog. I recommend checking that out. We do have a call for speakers, which is live and ongoing for these type of live casts. If anyone listening or someone from your company would like to share anything related to API strategy or business or security, I'm open to working on you with that. And keep an eye out for call for speakers. We have some big announcements coming soon about 2023 events in Nordic APIs world. And if you love APIs and want to contribute your thoughts, we do have an open submission policy for the blog. You can read about that at the Create With Us page. And we do have a bi-weekly newsletter, which I organize, and we shoot out about 6 articles every couple weeks on all things APIs. So if you're interested in getting more insights, definitely recommend signing up for that. And lastly, thank you so much to our sponsor. You can check out Curity and their OAuth server and identity and access management solutions at curity.io. So that's all for today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks, Joyce.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers. Bye-bye.